You probably still have no idea what your silence just caused, and that's the most dangerous part of it all, because when damage happens quietly, it never looks like damage from the outside, it just looks like distance, like two people slowly drifting apart without any clear reason, without any loud fight or final goodbye, just a gradual disappearance of something that once felt real, something that once felt certain. And you might still be telling yourself that you didn't do anything wrong, that you simply stayed quiet, that you needed time, that you didn't want to complicate things, but what you didn't realize is that silence is never empty, it always carries meaning, and the person on the other side doesn't experience it as peace, they experience it as confusion, as rejection, as a shift they can't explain but can deeply feel. And while you were choosing not to say anything, they were trying to understand everything, replaying conversations in their head, going back to the smallest details, wondering where the energy changed, where the warmth disappeared, where they started feeling like they were talking to a wall instead of a person who once made them feel seen. And the hardest part is that your silence didn't just leave a gap, it filled that gap with questions, with insecurities, with thoughts that slowly started turning against them, making them believe that maybe they were too much, maybe they cared too deeply, maybe they expected something that was never really there, and every second of your silence made those thoughts louder, heavier, harder to ignore, because when there are no answers, the mind doesn't stay quiet, it creates its own. And those answers are almost never kind, they don't protect feelings, they destroy them, slowly and silently, just like the silence that caused them, and you might think that if something was truly important, they would have stayed no matter what. But what you don't see is that they did stay, longer than they should have, longer than it was healthy for them, holding on to hope that your silence was temporary, that you would come back with clarity, with reassurance, with something that made sense of everything. But hope, when left unanswered, doesn't stay hope for long, it turns into exhaustion, into emotional fatigue, into a quiet realization that maybe they were the only one trying to keep something alive that you had already let go of without saying it out loud, and that realization doesn't come suddenly. It builds up over time, in late-night thoughts, in unsent messages, in moments where they stared at your name and decided not to reach out again because they were tired of feeling like they were forcing a connection that used to feel natural. And this is the part you never saw, the part your silence hid from you, the internal battle they were fighting every single day, trying to convince themselves to stay while also slowly learning how to let go. Not because they wanted to, but because your silence gave them no other choice, and in the end, it wasn't your words that pushed them away, it was the absence of them, it was the way you made them feel without saying anything at all, because sometimes not speaking says more than anything you ever could have said, and unfortunately, what your silence said was something they will never fully forget, and the most painful part is, you'll probably never even realize the exact moment they started giving up, because from your side it looked like nothing was happening, no arguments, no complaints, no dramatic endings, just a quiet shift in energy that was easy to ignore if you weren't paying attention, but on their side, everything was changing, slowly, deeply, irreversibly, because every time they chose not to text you again, it wasn't because they didn't want to, it was because they were tired of feeling like they were the only one trying to keep the connection alive. Every time they stopped themselves from asking, "What's wrong?" it was because they were afraid of getting no answer again, and every time they acted like they were okay, it was just another layer of protection they were building around a heart that had already been hurt too many times by your silence. And you might think they moved on easily, that they just let go without caring, but what you don't see is that letting go was the hardest thing they had to do, because they weren't just letting go of you. They were letting go of all the versions of you they had created in their mind, all the memories that once felt meaningful, all the possibilities they believed in, and that kind of detachment doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small, painful steps, in moments where they forced themselves not to check your messages, in days where they distracted themselves just to avoid thinking about you, in nights where your absence felt louder than anything else in their life, and slowly, piece by piece, they started choosing themselves, not because they stopped loving you, but because loving you in silence was destroying them. And the truth is, your silence didn't just create distance, it changed them. It made them more guarded, more careful, less willing to open up the way they once did, because when someone experiences that kind of emotional confusion, they don't just forget it, they carry it into everything that comes next, questioning intentions, doubting consistency, protecting themselves even when there is no threat, and that's the part your silence will never undo, the way it reshaped how they see connections, how they trust, how they love. And maybe one day you'll try to come back, maybe you'll have the words you couldn't say before, maybe you'll finally explain everything, but by then, it won't land the same, because the version of them that was waiting for those words doesn't exist anymore. They had to grow without them, heal without them, and learn to be okay without the closure you never gave. And even if they listen, even if they understand, there will always be a quiet distance between what you say now and what you didn't say when it mattered, because timing doesn't just change moments, it changes meaning, and words that come too late don't fix things, they just remind someone of how long they had to survive without them. And that's the reality of silence. It doesn't just pause a connection, it rewrites it. It turns something once full of potential into something that feels unfinished, unresolved, and no matter how much you try to go back, you can never return to the version of the story where things were still clear, still alive, still worth fighting for, because while you were silent, they were changing, and now, even if they still feel something, they've learned not to depend on it anymore. They've learned that sometimes the loudest answer is no answer at all, and once someone truly understands that, they don't chase clarity anymore, they become it, and by the time you finally find your voice, they've already found their peace, in a place where your silence can't reach them anymore. And maybe one day it will finally hit you, not all at once, not in some dramatic realization, but in a quiet, unexpected moment, when everything slows down just enough for you to feel what you once ignored. When you scroll back through old conversations and notice the shift you didn't notice before, when you see how they used to show up for you without hesitation, how they tried to keep things alive even when you started pulling away, and suddenly all those moments you overlooked will start making sense in a way they never did before, because distance has a way of revealing truths that presence often hides, and in that moment, you'll start to understand that your silence wasn't neutral. It wasn't harmless, it wasn't just nothing, it was something they felt every single day, something that slowly changed the way they saw you, the way they saw themselves, the way they experienced connection altogether. And the realization won't be loud, it will be heavy, it will sit with you in a way that words can't easily explain. Because you'll begin to see that while you were taking your time figuring things out, they were running out of strength trying to hold everything together. And there's a kind of regret that comes with that understanding, a quiet kind, the kind that doesn't ask for attention but doesn't leave either, the kind that shows up when you wish you had said something, anything, just to let them know they mattered, just to give them a reason to stay a little longer. And you'll start replaying your own silence the same way they once did, questioning why you didn't speak when you had the chance, wondering what would have changed if you had just been honest, if You had just shown up, if you had just broken that silence before it became something permanent, and the hardest part is realizing that there was a time when things could have been different, a time when your words still had the power to fix what was slowly breaking, but that time doesn't wait forever, it moves, it fades, it disappears without asking if you're ready, and by the time you finally understand the weight of what your silence did, you'll also understand that some things don't come back the same way. Some connections don't restart where they left off, because they weren't paused, they were changed, reshaped by everything that wasn't said, and you might try to reach out, you might type those messages you once held back, you might finally express everything you couldn't before, but there will always be a part of you that knows you're speaking into a space that no longer feels the same, a space that has already learned how to exist without you. And even if they respond, even if they listen, even if they forgive, there will be a difference you can't ignore, a subtle distance that wasn't there before, because forgiveness doesn't erase experience, it just makes peace with it, and they have already made peace with the version of you that chose silence over clarity. They have already accepted that sometimes people don't say what they feel, not because they don't feel it, but because they don't know how to express it, and in that acceptance, they found a way to let go without needing answers, and that's something your words can't undo anymore, because the closure you're trying to give now is something they had to create for themselves a long time ago, without you, without your explanation, without your voice, and there's a quiet strength in that, a strength that came from surviving the confusion your silence left behind, a strength that made them realize their worth doesn't depend on someone else's ability to communicate, and once someone reaches that point, they don't go back to chasing clarity, they don't go back to waiting for words that may or may not come, they move forward with a deeper understanding of what they deserve, of what they will no longer tolerate, and that's when the full weight of your silence finally becomes clear, not just in what it took away, but in what it created, a version of them that no longer needs what you didn't give, a version of them that learned how to walk away without looking back, and maybe that's the real consequence of silence, not just that it ends things, but that it teaches the other person how to end them on their own, how to find closure in absence, how to heal without explanation, and once someone learns that, they don't unlearn it, they carry it with them, into every future connection, into every new beginning, and while you might still be trying to go back, they've already moved into a version of life where your silence is no longer a question, no longer a wound, just a chapter they've already closed, quietly, completely, and for good. And the truth is, silence doesn't just end conversations, it changes timelines, it creates a version of reality where two people who once understood each other without effort suddenly become strangers who can't even explain where things went wrong, and you might still hold on to the belief that if something was meant to stay, it would have stayed regardless of silence. But what you fail to see is that connections don't survive on feelings alone. They survive on expression, on reassurance, on the small but consistent reminders that say, "I'm still here," and when those reminders disappear, even the strongest feelings start to weaken, not because they were fake, but because they were left unsupported, and your silence was exactly that, an absence of support where it was needed the most, and while you were convincing yourself that nothing needed to be said, they were slowly learning that everything did, because without words, without clarity, without even the smallest acknowledgement, they were left alone with their thoughts, and thoughts, when left unchecked, can become louder than reality, they can twist intentions, they can create fears, they can turn love into doubt and doubt into distance, and by the time you realize what happened, the distance doesn't feel like something you can simply close anymore, it feels like something that has already settled. something that has already been accepted, something that has already become a part of how things are now, and that's the part that hurts the most, not just losing the connection, but realizing it didn't have to happen this way, realizing that a few honest words at the right time could have changed everything, could have saved something that slowly slipped away, and that kind of realization stays with you. It follows you into quiet moments, into late nights, into times when you find yourself thinking about what could have been if you had just spoken when it mattered, and you'll start to notice the absence in ways you didn't before, in the lack of their presence, in the silence where their voice used to be, in the emptiness of conversations that no longer happen. And it will feel different, because now you understand that this wasn't just distance that happened naturally, it was distance that was created, shaped by every moment you chose not to say something, and that awareness changes everything. It makes you see silence for what it really is, not peace, not patience, but sometimes avoidance, sometimes fear, sometimes a missed chance to be honest when honesty was the only thing that could have kept things real. And you'll start to realize that silence has consequences that don't show up immediately, they build over time, quietly, subtly, until one day you look around and notice that something important is no longer there, and by then, it's not about fixing it anymore, it's about accepting it, accepting that some things don't break loudly, they fade, they disappear in the spaces where words should have been, and that's the kind of ending silence creates, not dramatic, not obvious, but permanent in a way that's hard to undo, because it doesn't just remove a person, it removes the version of the connection that once felt effortless, the version where everything made sense without needing explanation, and once that version is gone, no amount of words later can fully bring it back, because what's lost isn't just communication, it's timing, it's presence, it's the feeling of being understood in the moment it mattered, and without that, even the strongest emotions start to feel like something from the past, something that belonged to a different time, a different version of both of you, and maybe that's the final lesson silence leaves behind, that what you don't say can matter just as much as what you do, that absence can shape outcomes just as strongly as action, and that sometimes, the biggest mistakes aren't made through the wrong words, but through the lack of the right ones, and once you truly understand that, you'll never see silence the same way again, because you'll know that behind every quiet moment, there's a potential consequence, a potential ending, a potential loss that could have been avoided, if only you had chosen to speak. And maybe the most unsettling part of all of this is realizing that silence doesn't just affect the moment it exists in, it echoes far beyond it, it follows both people in completely different ways, shaping how they think, how they feel, how they respond to every connection that comes after. Because while you might eventually move forward thinking it was just a phase, just a misunderstanding, just something that didn't work out, for them it became a lesson they didn't ask for but had to learn anyway, a lesson about how quickly things can change without explanation, about how someone can go from being present to distant without saying a word, and that kind of experience doesn't just disappear, it rewires something inside a person, it makes them more aware of silence, more sensitive to shifts in energy, more cautious when something feels even slightly off, and that caution becomes a part of them, something they carry into every future interaction, not as a weakness, but as a form of protection, because once someone has been left to figure things out on their own for too long, they stop expecting clarity from others, they start relying on themselves instead, and while that might sound like growth, there's also a quiet sadness in it, because it means they had to become strong in a place where they once felt safe being open, and your silence was a part of that transformation. whether you meant it to be or not, and on your side, the silence might take longer to catch up to you. It might not feel heavy at first, it might even feel justified, like you were doing what you thought was right at the time, but time has a way of shifting perspective, of making you see things differently when you're no longer in the middle of them, and one day, without warning, you'll start connecting the dots. You'll start seeing how your silence aligned with their withdrawal, how your absence of words slowly matched their absence of presence, and that's when it begins to sink in, that this wasn't just something that happened, it was something that unfolded, moment by moment, choice by choice, silence by silence, until there was nothing left to hold on to, and that realization can be difficult to sit with, because it forces you to acknowledge the role you played in something ending, not through action, but through inaction, not through harsh words, but through the lack of any words at all, and there's a certain kind of accountability in that, one that doesn't come with clear closure or easy resolution, because you can't go back and fill those silences the way you can apologize for something you said. You can't recreate the exact moments where your voice could have made a difference, you can only recognize them in hindsight, and that's what makes it so heavy. The understanding that there were chances, real chances, where things could have been different, where a simple sentence, a moment of honesty, a small reassurance could have shifted the entire outcome, but those chances passed quietly, just like the silence that replaced them, and now all that remains is the awareness of what wasn't done, what wasn't said, what wasn't given when it mattered most, and that awareness stays. It doesn't fade easily, it becomes a reference point for how you handle things moving forward. A reminder that silence isn't always the safer choice, that avoiding something doesn't make it disappear, it just delays the impact until it shows up in a different form, often stronger than before, and maybe that's the deeper consequence of your silence, not just what it ended, but what it taught, what it revealed, what it changed in both of you. Because in the end, silence is never just empty space, it's a message, a decision, a response in its own way, and whether you intended it or not, it said something loud enough to be felt, understood, and eventually accepted, just not in the way you might have hoped. And now, as everything settles into what it has become, the only thing left is the quiet understanding that some things aren't lost because of what was said, but because of what never was, and that's a truth that stays long after the silence itself is gone, and at some point, whether you try to ignore it or not, you'll begin to understand that silence has a strange way of teaching lessons that words never could, because when everything is left unsaid, the consequences don't arrive all at once, they unfold slowly, they settle into your routine, into your thoughts, into the quiet spaces where you finally have no distractions left to hide behind. And that's when it starts to feel real, not as a memory, not as something distant, but as something that still lingers, something that still carries weight, and you'll realize that silence didn't just create distance between you and them, it also created a distance between who you were and who you could have been if you had chosen differently, if you had spoken when it felt uncomfortable, if you had expressed what you were unsure about instead of waiting for clarity to magically appear on its own. And that realization is not easy to sit with, because it forces you to confront the version of yourself that chose quiet over honesty, avoidance over vulnerability, and while it might have felt easier in the moment, it came at a cost you didn't fully see at the time, a cost that only becomes clear when everything has already changed, when the connection you once had is no longer something you can return to, and as much as you might want to believe that time can fix anything, that enough distance can somehow reset things back to how they were, deep down you'll know that some changes are permanent, not because people don't care anymore, but because they've already adapted to a reality where they had to move forward without you, where they had to rebuild their sense of stability without your presence, without your words, without your reassurance. And once someone has done that, once they've found a way to be okay on their own after being left in silence, they don't easily go back to a place where they depend on someone else for clarity. They don't easily reopen doors that took so much effort to close. And that's the quiet truth you'll have to face, that by the time you understand the impact of your silence, they've already understood something deeper, something more final, that they can survive without the answers you never gave, that they can create peace even in the absence of explanation. And that kind of realization changes a person in ways that can't be undone. It makes them more grounded, more self-reliant, but also more distant from the version of themselves that once believed in waiting, in hoping, in holding on without knowing where things were going. And while you might still find yourself thinking about what could have been, they've already made peace with what is. They've already accepted that sometimes the closure we seek from others is something we have to give ourselves, and in doing so, they've freed themselves from the need for your words, from the need for your explanation, from the need for anything that comes too late. And that's where the final shift happens, not in what was lost, but in what was learned, because silence, in the end, doesn't just take things away, it reveals what was missing all along. It exposes the gaps that words were meant to fill, and once those gaps are seen clearly, they can't be ignored anymore. They become a standard, a boundary, a quiet understanding of what is needed for something to truly last. And as you carry this experience forward, you'll start to notice how differently you approach things, how you hesitate a little less to speak, how you recognize the importance of clarity in moments where you once would have chosen silence. And maybe that's the only way something like this finds meaning, not in being undone, but in shaping what comes next, in making sure that the same silence doesn't repeat itself in another story, another connection, another chance that deserves more than what was left unsaid. Because in the end, silence is only harmless when both people understand it, but when it replaces communication, when it stands in place of honesty, it becomes something else entirely, something that carries consequences far beyond what it seems. And now you know that, now you understand that what you didn't say mattered just as much as anything you ever could have said, and that understanding, as heavy as it may feel, is something you won't be able to unlearn. Because once you see the impact of silence this clearly, you don't just hear it the same way again, you feel it, in every pause, in every hesitation, in every moment where words are needed but not given. And from that point on, the choice to stay silent will never feel as simple as it once did, because you'll always remember what your silence once caused, and how much it changed, even without making a sound. And in the end, what stays with you isn't just the memory of them. It's the awareness of how everything unfolded without noise, without closure, without a clear ending you could point to and say, that's where it all broke. Because the truth is, it didn't break in a single moment, it slowly dissolved in all the moments where something should have been said but wasn't, where something should have been clarified but was left hanging, where something should have been felt together but was experienced alone. And that kind of ending is different. It doesn't give you the relief of understanding. It doesn't give you the satisfaction of knowing exactly what went wrong. It just leaves you with pieces, with fragments of what used to make sense, and now exist without context, without explanation. And as time passes, those pieces don't disappear, they settle into your memory in a quieter way, not as sharp pain, but as a constant reminder of what silence can do when it replaces communication. And you begin to see that this wasn't just about losing someone. It was about losing the chance to show up differently, to be more present, to choose honesty even when it felt uncomfortable, and that realization changes the way you look at everything moving forward, because you start to understand that connections aren't sustained by assumption, they aren't held together by unspoken feelings alone, they need expression, they need effort, they need those small, consistent moments of reassurance that say, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere, and without that, even something meaningful can fade into something unrecognizable. And maybe the hardest truth to accept is that your silence didn't just take something away from them, it also took something away from you, something you didn't realize you were losing until it was already gone, the ease of what you had, the comfort of what felt natural, the possibility of what it could have become if you had just spoken when it mattered. And now all that remains is the understanding that there was a version of this story where things didn't end like this, a version where your words arrived on time, where your presence stayed consistent, where your silence didn't have to be interpreted because it never replaced what needed to be said, but that version no longer exists, not because it wasn't possible, but because it wasn't chosen. And that's what makes it real, what makes it final. Because in the end, it's not always the loud mistakes that shape our lives, sometimes it's the quiet ones, the ones we barely notice in the moment, the ones that feel small until they're not, until they've already changed everything in ways we can't undo, and as much as you might wish to go back, to rewrite those silent moments with words, with clarity, with honesty, you can't. You can only move forward with what you now understand, with the weight of what silence truly means, and maybe that's where the story finally finds its ending, not in regret, not in trying to fix what can't be fixed, but in learning, in choosing differently the next time, in making sure that when something matters, you don't let silence speak for you again, because now you know what it says, now you know what it does. Now you know how deeply it can affect someone who was only waiting for you to say something, anything, that showed you cared. And maybe they'll never fully know that you did, maybe they'll carry their own version of the story where your silence meant something else entirely, but that's the reality of it. Silence doesn't just leave things unsaid, it leaves things misunderstood. And once something is understood the wrong way for long enough, it becomes truth in the other person's mind, a truth they build their closure on, a truth they use to move on, and by the time you realize it, that truth is no longer something you can change. It's something you have to accept, and in that acceptance, there's a quiet ending, not dramatic, not loud, but complete in its own way. Because it marks the moment you finally understand that silence was never empty, it was always saying something, and unfortunately, by the time you heard it clearly, it had already said enough to end everything.